Good morning. This subject is going to be very interesting. Today we're going to talk about toxicity and red flags. These are very popular terms lately, especially in the dating world and as well as friendships and I would say general relationships. These are very common phrases thrown around in our culture. And I always find all the social media platforms like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, there will always be a lot of posts about what to look out for. That this is a toxic relationship. This is what defines a toxic relationship, and these are red flags in a partner or in another human being. These are red flags. Of course, I want to relook at this because I feel that taking a look at these phrases, again, we're going to find how unsure we really are about what we mean. About what we mean when we say toxic. About what we mean when we say red flag. And of course, the biggest preconception is that we know what we want and we know who we are. And we know what's good for us and we know what's bad for us. In some sense we do, and in some sense we don't. And I think the real question that I always try to provoke is, well, which circumstance does this follow? In which circumstance do I know that this is good for me and this is bad for me? And so let's look at red flags. For those of you that don't know the general concept of red flags, even though it isn't really defined by any particular authority, red flag is our way of saying that these are signs that maybe a family member is displaying, a friend or a lover, dating partner or dating potential partner, that these are signs that we should discontinue the relationship or distance ourselves from. Maybe that is a better way of explaining that. Distance ourselves away from these people. But what has always intrigued me is the signs are always outward. And by that I mean they're always looking at what the other displays and never looking at what we display of ourselves. So one concept in my dating life, or not one concept, but one profound reflection in my dating life is that I found myself always picking a particular kind of woman. Now, I would always say that now at first, without reflection, these always seemed like random occurrences or maybe bad luck, that I always encountered these certain kind of women. But actually, and so if I were to use these terms, right, I would say all these women had red flags, right? Red flags, women that I should have strayed myself away from. But what's interesting is that there is a red flag before the red flag. And before red, there's yellow. There's caution. And I'm always amazed about the way we talk about red flags, because these are things that we say that we should stop at. But there are things that build up and choices that are made before we get to those red flags. And I think that's what I really want to address in some way. Because I want to make a point that it's not always about the people that display the signs that are called red flags, but it's more about our decisions that are leading up to those things that are red flags. And to make an example of myself, again, I with reflection, I found myself always picking a particular kind of woman. And these women would never, you could say, it was always unrequited. You know, it was never, the love was never brought back to me. You know, they never, I would like them and they would not like me, right? But I had a particular fondness for this. And I remember I would when I was younger, and I'm still young, but when I was, at least when I began to realize this, that I would choose, in some sense, a masochistic way of pursuing women, in the sense that I chose women unconsciously in some way that I knew would not love me in return, that I knew would ultimately cause me suffering, a lot of suffering. And when we acknowledge those decisions, because those were repetitive occurrences in my life. Why were these things happening? Why did I always end up in some of the same situations? And this is where Einstein's quote really hits you in the mouth. You know, the idea of repetition is insanity. I'm summarizing here, but repetition is insanity. And when those occurrences repeat themselves, it's not so much that these women displayed red flags. I think in some sense, these women very much made it clear in their own ways about that they were never going to have that love for me. And it was my own an illusion to fool myself into thinking that maybe I could convince them differently. Maybe I could, it would just take time, something of those sorts. But what I'm trying to say is that if I were to tell you a story about my dating life and the women that I've encountered, I think most people would say, well, all those women displayed red flags about what you shouldn't have gone for. But actually, what I want to challenge is it was actually my decisions that were the red flags, my illusionment that were the red flags that led to these manifestations of what we would call a red flag. So there's a lot of things that are hidden before the red flag occurs. And the way I look at red flags now, and at least the way that we use them in our culture, is that there is a lot of things decided and made and refused as well that led to this thing we call a red flag from another person. And I think me sharing that is one example of that, that it can at least show that not always is it someone else. Because, well, let me start it this way. When I read Freud, and when I read some works of other psychoanalysts, the one thing that Freud and these other psychoanalysts talk about is that there is something to say about our desire for suffering. And this, I remember Freud, at least Freud through the lens of Adam Phillips, would say that this desire for suffering that we deem as pleasurable is our way of survival, a sort of masochistic way of survival, or sadomasochistic way of survival. And I think it's really important to look at the decisions that are made before the red flags. Because to me, those are the red flags. Those are the real red flags. And we always are so, I guess, tunnel vision on other people and what they do to us. But in reality, it's never one person. It's how we relate to each other and how we respond to each other. And the one thing that we don't do often is take a look at ourselves and the decisions that we're making. I remember a woman that I was once talking to. She said that she liked, she said F-word boys. And she said that jokingly, but to fast forward the story, she acknowledged that she had a tendency to pick what she would call men that had red flags. But what I ended up finding out even later on is that really these tendencies were signs of her own failures with her father, her own her horrible relationship with her father. and this was something that she admitted to me, not it was not something that I pulled out of her. It was something that she admitted to me and something that she acknowledged. And it's strange because you can see that this is a woman that wants to get away from this type of suffering and relationships. But at the same time, there's this, you could say, unconscious drive towards this suffering. And I acknowledge that through her joke of saying that she likes F-word boys. And, you know, because that's what's interesting about a joke too, is that even though we say something as a joke, there's always some, you could say, kernel of truth to that joke. That's the hidden part about it. It just makes the blow less. It just makes the blow less hurtful, you could say. Now, toxic is another term. Yeah, moving on to toxic now. Toxic is something that I would say is similar to red flags, but toxic in our cultural sense always deems something that is not good for us. Of course, I also have to question this. How do we know what is not good for us? I think we could all agree that there is the more extreme things that we could say are definitely not good for us. Abuse and emotional abuse, physical abuse, those examples. But then there's everything in between. Everything that is sort of in the gray areas. And what I've realized when people use the word toxic, the one thing I have to ask is, well, is it true that everything is it true that everything we deem as bad can it have no benefit for us? And is it true that if it's bad, does it have no benefit for us? Is it always true that that is the case? And to be honest, it takes us, just for me at least, it takes a simple reflection of, there were many moments in my life that I thought something was not good for me. Something was bad for me. But it would prove to be beneficial in the long run, or good immediately. Sometimes I'm afraid of the word toxic because it can be an unconscious way of denying or avoiding work, the hardships of relationships, the hardships of friendships, family members. There seems to always be this push of, we need to avoid toxic people, we need to know the red flags, we need to just avoid. And this is always concerning to me, always, because it creates a culture of only positivity, that there is nothing negative that we need or should deal with. But of course, the contradiction is that in our very effort to avoid and strive against negativity, we ourselves succumb to negativity in our act of avoiding it. And so avoidance for me is never the proper answer, but how do we have a proper relationship with the things that we call toxic, the things that we call red flags? Is there a different way of redescribing our experiences? Is there a new perspective that we can shed light on? I think perhaps the most toxic thing to do to ourselves is to never entertain any other possibilities of interpreting our experience, of never entertaining what is possible from what seems impossible. And this is why it's always good to question these terms and these phrases, because slowly we become, you could say, a society based on some kind of illusion that we can avoid all these things and never look deeply into ourselves about why are we avoiding these things, why we want to avoid these things, and why, and what are the decisions made before the things that we call toxic and red flags. Anyways, I hope that helps, and I hope that sheds some perspective. All right, take care.